Well, Darwin Day is commemorated all over the world as a celebration of science and in recognition of the man who changed the way we think about our human origins, Charles Darwin, who was born exactly 206 years ago this very moment. I'm not sure about that last bit. Humanism as an organised movement didn't really exist when Charles Darwin was alive, but a pretty good case can be made for thinking that he was a humanist, or would have been a humanist. And where better to celebrate Darwin Day than in Bournemouth Natural Science Society. After the talk, please do join us for light refreshments, just £1 for a bargain meal deal, cup of tea and lots of nibbles. Okay, well, you can't get a better deal than that. We do love to hang around and chat, so do please join us. Well, our speaker today is a Vice President of the British Humanist Association and a representative to the UN Human Rights Council for the International Humanist and Ethical Union. He's written and edited more than 30 books. He's just told me that he's got another book coming out next month called The Challenge of Things. And on the way down here from London this evening, he's been writing another book on his laptop, which is coming out in about a year's time. And he'll say a few words about that. He's a regular contributor to BBC Radio. He's come all the way from London to be with us this evening, and he said that it's actually the relaxing part of his day to come and be with us. So will you please give a resounding welcome to Anthony Grayling.
Thank you very much indeed, and happy birthday to Charles Darwin. It's quite right to say that the word humanism wasn't used in Darwin's day quite the way we use it now. But of course, humanism, as is the set of ideals and outlook, is as old, if not older, than Socrates. And when one looks back across the landscape of thought, one sees that kind of attitude, the attitude that says we must think for ourselves, we must try to understand our fellows with generosity and sympathy. We must accept the great diversity that there is in human nature and human needs and interests, and we must try to adjust our relationships to others on that basis. That is the humanist outlook. Humanism isn't, of course, a set of prescriptions and proscriptions. There are no do's and don'ts other than the adjuration to think for oneself. But that challenge that Socrates issued to his fellow Athenians, where he said to them, the unconsidered life is not worth living, and with that rather resounding remark that he made, that the life chosen, the life thought about, where you've worked your way through the central concepts of shape and colour, our values, that is the kind of life that's worth living, because it is a life that's been reflected on. And when Socrates said that, he was the first president of all humanist associations, in my view, because you'll notice that there are some very deep assumptions that lie behind it. One of those assumptions is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to the question of how we should live, what we should think, how we should behave, what we should believe, but instead that we really do have to work it out for ourselves. And some of the greatest of heroes, and Charles Darwin is certainly at the very pinnacle of this, are people who lived at a time when it was, in a number of different ways, either literally dangerous to hold a view. For example, Copernicus's view about the nature of the universe. If you subscribe to it in the late 16th century, as Giordano Bruno did to his cost, you might very well end up resembling a piece of bacon, ready for consumption. Poor old Giordano Bruno was burned to death in the Campo dei Fiori in Rome, because among other things he had accepted and publicly avowed his belief in the Copernican view of the universe. But even in Darwin's day, Darwin, as you know, kept for decades quiet about his views, about his discoveries, because he was so anxious about the effect that it would have, not just on society at large, but even on his own reputation, perhaps. And that's the kind of thing anybody might feel very tentative about. To put forward a view which is so revolutionary in its implication that one feels very, very hesitant, indeed, very diffident about expressing that view. But then to express it, when The Origin of Species was published in 1859, The implications were perfectly clear, but Darwin didn't leave it up to implication. In 1871 he published The Descent of Man, and The Descent of Man makes it perfectly clear that the full entailment of his discoveries in natural science, in biology, and the biology of evolution, is that we human beings are fully part of nature, that we are descended from earlier forms, that we share a very great deal in common with other animals in nature. And of course this view, in its day, in its impact on his contemporaries, was pretty extraordinary. In fact, Darwin is one of the two great pillars, and I mentioned Copernicus already, and I'll do it in a kind of sort of metaphoric way. But if you think about the transition of thought that occurred between the middle of the 16th century and the middle of the 19th century, so that's from the publication of Copernicus' book on the heavens and Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species, in that period of time, the mindset of humanity, or at the very least of the somewhat more educated and reflective parts of humanity, because of course there are hundreds of millions of people today who think that the world was created 6,000 years ago, and that all the fossil evidence that has been appealed to by people like Darwin was laid down by the flood. And this is a very serious view. I've been myself to the Creation Museum near Oklahoma City. I had my gasp flabbered to the greatest imaginable extent by what I saw in that museum. And it would have been amusing, it would have just been risible, had it not been for the troops and troops and troops of young children who were taken around, coming off school buses and being told this is Methuselah and this is and so on. So it is a fact of our world today that these very great discoveries, this immense achievement of the human mind, which is science and which is the understanding that we have of our universe and of ourselves, of this totality of the universe, is not accepted by everybody. But of course the view itself and the way that it was achieved, the application of the scientific method, for example, has resulted in a world which is very much the world of Copernicus and Darwin and all those in between who made contemporary science possible. So that's something of the story that I'd like to tell. I'd like to tell a story this evening in which Darwin is, as it were, the keystone of the arch. And he comes in with the clincher at the end of a process of thought, where, like the great movement of a tectonic plate in the surface of the planet, the way that educated thought about the world changed 90 degrees, a shift of perspective, shift of vision, a complete revolution in the mindset, in the outlook of educated humanity took place. And it's a story full of fascinations, because if we were able to jump into an H.G. Wells time machine and take ourselves back to the 16th century, let us say to the workroom of Dr. Dee on the banks of the Thames in the second half of the 16th century, and eavesdrop a little bit on what he spent his time doing, which those of you who were reading about him in the bath last night will remember, is that every so often he would get his scryer, that is somebody expert looking into a crystal ball or into a show stone, which might be a polished piece of rock, and communicate with angels in order to try to get a translation of the original Adamic language in which God had instructed Adam how to name the animals, and to crack the secret of the universe, because of course it was thought in the great outburst of flurry of thinking about Hermeticism and the Kabbalah and magical techniques, that there was a shortcut to knowledge of the universe, and a shortcut therefore to an understanding of how you could manipulate nature. After all, there's a nice little piece of logic at work behind this, which is, if everything is made of four elements, earth, air, fire and water, and you could adjust the combination of those elements in anything, then you could turn something common, like a piece of wood or a lump of lead, into something rather desirable, like gold. So what the alchemists were very, very keen to do indeed was to find out how to adjust the arrangements of the elements of things. They were also, of course, keen to live forever or to stay youthful for as long as possible, and it was thought that if you could do that kind of adjustment, you might be able to achieve that also. So that was a great targets of alchemy and of magic. And indeed, so logical was the thinking that if gold was the best and most desirable arrangement of elements, then the consumption of gold, I mean quite literally eating or drinking it or consuming it in some way, would make you healthy, because since it is a perfect arrangement, then it would help your body to adjust itself and be the right arrangement also. I don't quite know how many alchemists, but I suppose the richer they were, the more likely they were to poison themselves by the process, but it certainly happened. But as you can see, given the wrong premises and the best application of human reason, you can reach all sorts of absurdities, and they were reached in their thousands during the course of the 16th century. And the reason why this great ferment of thought was going on was because there had been a moment of fracture in the hegemony over the human mind of religious orthodoxy. When in 1517 Luther nailed his theses to the church door in Wittenberg, every blow of the hammer was another fracture in this marmoreal structure which was the church and its hold over what was permissible to believe. Again, if you take a few steps back and you look, you know how you do with your Google Maps, you can get closer in and further out. Well, intellectually, if you go further out, you notice something rather striking about the history of thought in the millennium before Luther, and that is that right back in the 4th century of the Common Era, which is when, of course, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and you will remember from your reading of this that Constantine in 313 said that Christianity was okay to be one of the religions of the empire, decriminalized it, and by 370 or 380, when the Edict of Thessalonica was issued and said it's the only religion of the empire, it didn't take very long to get its hold. But at that time, in the 4th century and 5th, 6th century, the patristic writers, the fathers of the church, were very productive as writers in producing what's called apologetics. This is the kind of literature in which you explain and persuade. They were trying to persuade the skeptical public that the doctrines of the church were true, and they were defending those claims, resurrection, miracles, virgin birth, and the rest. By, of course, the high medieval period, then there was no longer any need to write apologetical literature to persuade people, because by that time it was quite literally, a criminal offence not to believe those doctrines. So you don't have to persuade anybody, you just kill them if they said that they disagree with you. So things had changed dramatically, and that meant that in the medieval period, right up into the early period of the Renaissance, it was extremely dangerous, not only to be unorthodox, that is, in your beliefs, but to fail to be orthopractic, that is, to fail to practice your religion. Indeed, in this country, right up until 19th century, it was a requirement to pay tithes and to attend church. It was, not a matter of choice, really. Observance was something required. And the temporal powers and the ecclesiastical powers were one in ensuring that that should be the case. So by the time that Luther nailed those theses up, there was a totalizing grip. It was a totalitarian ideology over the minds of people, and people therefore found it extremely difficult to think differently, to see the world differently. They were so firmly supplied with a thick pair of conceptual spectacles that the world just couldn't look any other way. There's a kind of parallel in our own day, and the parallel is, I suppose, Roman Catholics and Muslims. Both of those communities are such that they're very conscious of how effective early indoctrination is. It makes it very difficult indeed for people to feel and see and think differently. Very painful process, therefore, to break away from those beliefs, and not just because of the community cohesion that supports and affirms those beliefs, but for yourself to see the world differently. It's a very hard job. So if we were to think about a young Muslim person, let us say, in a Muslim community, perhaps in a Muslim-majority country today, and compare that person to a Christian in the 13th or 14th century, you will see that there is a great commonality. terribly difficult to think differently. And that is why Luther was such a revolution, because when Luther nailed up those theses, in response he was very angry about the fact that the church was raising money to build St. Peter's Basilica. They were getting the money by selling indulgences. Well, the more you pay, the less time you spend in purgatory. You have 1,000,000 years off in purgatory for tenfold. That kind of it's been very well said, about Bernie Madoff, you may remember, that his big mistake was that he promised returns in this life. Well, if he'd only just been conscious of what the church had been successfully doing for centuries, then he wouldn't have made that mistake. This was what irritated Luther, among other things. And so he put those theses up on the door, and every blow of the hammer, as I say, introduced another fracture to the surface of this marmoreal grip on thought. Because what he was asserting by that means was liberty of conscience. That one should be able to think for oneself about matters that relate to the salvation of your soul and its eternal destiny. And of course this was a very great moment for people who thought that the doctrines of the church managed its grip on the minds and hearts of people by saying, you need an intermediary, you need the intercession of the saints, you need an ordained priesthood to represent you, to pray on your behalf, to give you the sacraments, to give you a blessing or release from your sins if you perform the right penance. And Luther's claim, of course, was that there are no intermediaries between the individual and the deity. You are responsible for your own soul's destiny, and you don't need that kind of structure any longer, because that structure is what keeps the individual down and controlled, and to assert independence from it, therefore, was in itself a massively revolutionary step. But human beings being what they are, and we can be an unpleasant bunch, and we just need to turn on the news any night of the week and see how unpleasant we can be. But we're also sometimes quite a smart bunch as well, and it took very little time indeed for people to appreciate the fact that if you are entitled to liberty of conscience in religious matters, then you are entitled to liberty of thought more generally, liberty of inquiry. Why can't you ask questions? Why can't you challenge authority? Now, Luther didn't come out of nowhere and nothing. He came out of what was already beginning to be some creaks and groans in this matter of whether we should accept the authority of the ancients or tradition handed down or some body like the church. Because some years, a couple of decades before he nailed up those theses, something rather special happened. In fact, in the palmy year 1492, now everybody knows that in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and to the surprise of all the people who lived there, discovered the New World. And also, of course, it was a year of great tragedy, the year of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. But it was a year in which a little book was published called De Erroribus Pliny, which no doubt you also read about last night, on the errors of Pliny. And it was a little book which had resulted from the fact that somebody was trying to produce a new edition of Pliny's Natural History. In itself, by the way, one of the most entertaining books that you could imagine. In the 36th book of the Natural History, Pliny tells us that the great painter of antiquity, Apelles, was able to command, as he put it, the wealth of a small town for one painting, plus ça change. So, art has always been very expensive at the top end. And Apelles is the person to whom it's attributed the saying, not a day without a line, not a single day without practicing his skill. Anyway, in this book, in the Natural History by Grayling, there's a great deal of discussion of human anatomy, of medicine, pharmacopoeia, and so on. And this editor noticed a large number of errors in it, and tried to justify the errors, or thought that perhaps he had been wrong and a mistake in his own studies, but came to the conclusion, in fact, that they were genuine errors. And that by itself was a significant moment, because the ancients were held in great regard. They were treated as authorities. To disagree with them was a very serious matter. The view was, you see, that in the most remote past, it was a golden age. Everybody was taller, handsomer, more beautiful, certainly smarter, and they knew better, and people later on. Things just got progressively worse ever since, and so where we are now, it is the usual kind of thing that people think. Because if you imagine your own childhood, you didn't pay taxes, somebody drove you around, who gave you sweets and presents on your birthday. Of course the world's got worse since then. I mean, why wouldn't it? And it's also the case, of course, that summers are shorter and grass isn't quite as green as it was then either. So it's natural to export this attitude to life as we get older and more in depth to history itself. And so the thought was that human history has been a declension from this golden age where people knew better. And so the authorities of the past were regarded as being really sacrosanct in their views. So this little book on the areas of clinic, that in itself was a revolutionary dart at the authority of the past. So it wasn't as though Luther was coming completely out of right field. Already there were these creaks and groans, but he nailed this up. I assert my liberty of conscience. So immediately people began to say, well, in that case, can't we be free to challenge and to think again and to ask again the questions which actually don't seem to have been answered all that well in the past by these putative authorities. But even so, Copernicus, when he wrote his book about the revolutions of the heavenly bodies, in the preface to it, which he himself didn't write, by the way, it was written by the person who prepared it for the press, because the book was only published right at the very end of Copernicus' life. And legend has it that a volume of the printed word was put into his hands on his deathbed. So that's how close to the wire publication of it was. But the preface that was written for it said, of course the sun isn't at the centre of the universe. This is just a model. It just makes the arithmetic better. You can get rid of Ptolemy's epicycles and equids and so on. And it just makes it rather more, rather easier really to do the math, as Americans would say. But of course we don't really think that the sun's at the centre. And for anybody to assert that they believe the literal truth of the Copernican model was, as I say, in danger right up until Galileo's time, because it was Galileo's problem that he had not only accepted, indeed not only provided empirical proof by looking through a telescope that the Copernican model was correct, but he had taught it. And he had been instructed some years before he was put on trial, when he was put on trial in 1632, that he'd been told as far back as 1616 that he wasn't allowed to teach the Copernican doctrine as true. And that's what got him into trouble, and he had to say that for him the earth hadn't moved. Well, no, he said that the earth didn't move, just like a different thing, I suppose. Even though, as he said, leaving the courtroom, but he does, he mumbled to somebody, managed to escape with his life, he would have been burned if he hadn't recanted, and he was put under house arrest for the rest of his life. And this shows you that to be an inquirer, to be at the very frontiers of knowledge, of exploration, of seeing with your own eyes through a telescope what the truth of things was, and yet to be told by the church, all you have to do is look at Psalm 104. He has laid the foundations of the earth, that they may not be moved forever, so the earth doesn't move. Joshua, the sun and the moon stood still for a whole day, etc., etc. Since it says those things in the Bible, then it doesn't matter what you see, it ain't the truth, because the truth is in the scriptures. So it was David. These therefore were brave people, and they began a movement which Darwin brought to a conclusion, the first great chapter in changing the human mind. Because the change that they began to bring about in the perception of the world and of the human self was that until that moment, until the 16th century dawn, people thought that the world was at the centre of the universe, and that human beings were at the pinnacle of the material creation in the universe. And it was all about us. We were the point. We've been created by the deity, we've been given a world, we've been given management of the world. Adam had been given the command of all things. And at that time, while Copernicus was constructing his model and doing his sums, while Galileo was grinding lenses and putting together to make better and better telescopes and looking at the moons of Jupiter and so on, while that was happening, others were writing that kings ruled by divine right, because they derived by succession from Adam, government over all things, that God had made the hierarchy of things such that we human beings might be in the very midst of all creation, that is, in the great scale of being, the chain of being from the lowly worm to God himself. We were at the very focal point. We united the heavenly and the earthly. In us, the material and the spiritual met. And that the whole story of creation was about us and the destiny of our souls. This is why in medieval times, if you look at the literature available to the relatively few people who could read, most of it is what is known as contemptus mundi literature, contempt of the world. Because of course, our time here on this planet, which was even shorter then than it is now, life was pretty nasty and brutish, but definitely short, was a kind of exordium. It was a preface. It was the hallway to the real deal, which was eternal life. And you had to hang in there, because the devil and his minions were after you. Even when you sneezed and your soul darted out of your mouth, they'd get it back in quick, so I was saying next to you one time. The devil and his minions were always after you. Any little slip, and you could be in big trouble. And that was the rest of history from your point of view. So you had to obey, you had to pray, you had to confess, you had to get penance, and you had to be obedient. And then when you die, you might achieve the felicity that eternal life promises. The Renaissance, of course, changed that conception. The Renaissance said, actually, if you look at the world around you, you see beautiful things, flowers, you hear music, you can read poems or make poems for one another. The art of the medieval period is all about the virgin birth, or the crucifixion, or the resurrection, or the Annunciation. Because the art of the Renaissance is about landscapes and portraits of people, and fetch and showing the picnics on the grass. So a very different mindset, and already you could there see some of those changes that brought about the changes in thought also. But the idea that we, human beings, were absolutely the point, at the very centre of God's concern and attention, and that all creation had been made for us, and so it really was about us, was very, very severely challenged indeed by the idea that we might not be quite literally at the centre of the universe. Because if we're literally not at the centre of the universe, then there's some other point. Now you have to remember that the consequences of this view. I think it was in 1571 that a supernova was observed, and it was recorded in some detail by Tycho Brahe. It was seen also by Dr. Lee and lots of other people around the world. But a new bright star appeared in the constellation Cassiopeia. And this was, absolutely gobsmacking for people of the day who'd been taught that the fixed stars in their crystalline spheres, revolving in majesty around the earth, would never change. They were eternal and immutable. Aristotle had taught that. And Aristotle lived a long time ago, and he was really smart, so he must be right. And how could a new star appear in the sky, showing mutability, showing change? Also, when you thought about the relationship between the fixed stars and the planets, of course the word planet comes from an ancient Greek word meaning wanderer, because the planets tend to wander erratically around the sky, making a nuisance of themselves. But if you think about this, you realize that those crystalline spheres have to be a very, very long way away. They therefore have to be moving incredibly fast in order to rotate around the Earth as they do once every 24 hours. But if you see a new star in the heavens, and you begin to think that perhaps we're not at the centre of the universe, and you wonder where we are, you get this sudden vertiginous sense that you're moving about in empty space, a very, very, very long way from other things that there might be in the universe. And the universe is very, very much bigger than you imagine, and far less cozy, because all of a sudden the cold, howling wastes of these great voids out there, visible now in a different perspective altogether, press on your consciousness and make you recognize that this story that people have been living by for so long, when we were the point, that the whole of human history was moving towards the mobile telephone. So that was this was the cracks that began to appear in the edifice with Luther first, and liberty of conscience, and then liberty of inquiry, and the fact that people could put forward these absolutely radical ideas and radical thought that we weren't at the centre of things. And all the evidence began to accumulate. And it began to accumulate more and more quickly. Because the 17th century, a century of terrible tumult, a century in which there were only 4 years in which the states of Europe were not at war. Some states at war with some other states. Almost every single year of that century, and of course that century saw the 30 Years' War in 1618, 1648, Treaty of Westphalia, which created the Europe of the nation states, which has been such a magnificent success ever since. The tumult of that century is extraordinary, and it's a sort of tragic fact in a way that it is tumultuous times that produce great advances in thinking. Alas, if only peaceful times recommend themselves more to us. But I'll just give you one tiny illustration. You know that in 1939, the Royal Air Force, even though it had Spitfires and Hurricanes coming on stream by then, was still also flying Gloucester Gambler's biplanes. And by 1945, they had Whipple jet fighters in service. And this is how fast technology changes in times of emergency. It's also an illustration of a very telling remark by the philosopher Theodor Adorno, who said, all of human history shows that human beings have become much cleverer over time, but no more wise. And this is proved by the fact that we have developed a spear into the guided missile. Now you reflect on that fact, and you see that our own intelligence is one of our own worst enemies at times, and that illustrates that. Well, the 17th century was a time of great tumult. The 30 Years' War was as devastating for the German-speaking peoples of Europe as the Second World War was in the end. 1 in every 3 German-speaking people are said to have died either directly or indirectly as a result of that war. And there were some very terrible atrocities. You may have heard of the sack of Magdeburg in 1630, when the population of that city was massacred, murdered, almost all of them, and the city razed to the ground, a beautiful, wealthy city, by the armies of the Holy Roman Empire under Count Tilly. Well, it is extraordinary to think that against this background, that these great revolutions occurred in thought, and in particular, of course, the scientific revolution. Now, I mentioned earlier the fact that in the 16th century, once the liberty of thought idea had begun to take hold, what people rushed to do was to grab hold of these traditions of thought in Hermeticism and in the Kabbalah, and to try to find these magical shortcuts to answers about the universe. But in amongst the people who were doing that, sometimes it was the same person doing both alchemy and magic, but also at the same time chemistry and medicine, or doing astrology, but also doing astronomy. But sometimes it was people who recognized that the astrology and the magic and the Kabbalah and the Hermeticism were a load of nonsense. And what they wanted to try to do was to think with much greater austerity, much greater discipline of mind. And one of the things which is very striking about the early 17th century is how hard some of the great minds of that period thought about method, about how you inquire, how you accumulate evidence and evaluate it, how you test hypotheses. And the two of the great figures that are responsible for this are, of course, René Descartes, famous for having originated the saying, "I drink, therefore I am," and Francis Bacon. Now, Descartes was himself quite an astute mathematician. He made genuine contributions to the history of mathematics. In fact, we can all curse and pour vituperation on his name for those struggles he had with geometry at school, which all came from the fact that he liked to stay in bed until noon every day and do his thinking in bed. Because one day he was lying in bed and he was watching a fly walking on the ceiling of his room, and he thought to himself, if I take that wall as one axis and this wall as another axis, then I can plot the position of the fly with just 2 numbers. Any position that the fly takes in the wall can be plotted with just 2 numbers graphically. and the beginning of Cartesian coordinate geometry, and the recognition that you could represent geometry in algebra and vice versa, and hence all our miseries at school. Quite a lot of geometry that we did there stemmed exactly from that. Descartes' habit, by the way, of staying in bed very late every day was indirectly the result of his death. Not because he was lazy, but because when he went to the court of Queen Christina of Sweden, and she was persuaded, she'd invited him, by the way, to come to her wonderful Renaissance court to be the court philosopher. And he'd taken so long to get there that she'd forgotten he was coming. When he turned up, she'd lost her interest in philosophy and in Descartes. And so she made him write a play, which he did reluctantly. It was a very bad one. But the Swedes loved it, and they asked him to write another one. And they said, in this one, could we please have a shepherd and a shepherdess and an escape from a window? And he said, I'm off. I'm going back to the Netherlands, which is where he lived. And so reluctantly she said, oh, well, come on, I'll have a few tutorials with you there. But I'll have them at 5 o'clock in the morning in my library, unheated, in January of 1650. It was a cold winter that year. But as poor old Descartes caught a chill, he stood up thinking pneumonia, and he died. There's a little cornerstone to the story, by the way, which is that when Queen Christina was told of Descartes' death, she was horrified. She had killed the most famous philosopher in Europe by playing this trick on him. And so she said, well, I'm going to build a great mausoleum and bury him with the kings of Sweden. And she was a very forgetful lady, Christina, and no sooner had she come up with this idea than she forgot it. And so he was buried in unconsecrated ground, because it was a Protestant country, it was a Catholic. And 17 years later, he was exhumed to be taken back to France and buried in state. And somebody on the way pinched his head out of curiosity. You know, it's a very scientific point of view. Take the head of a genius so you can try to work out why he was so smart. But those of you who've read any Descartes, studied him, will know that he's the originator of the modern mind-body problem. You know, how do you explain the relation of mind and the body? So the fact that his body is now buried in Saint-Germain, just opposite the Go Cafe, and his head is in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, so the mind-body problem. But anyway, so his great importance at this period, apart from his contributions in philosophy and mathematics, was to method, the question of how you inquire, how you use evidence, what steps of reasoning you take, how you review them, in order to try to arrive at truth, in order to avoid the excesses and the fantasticalities of the Hermetic and Kabbalistic and magical traditions, which people like Descartes, and even more to the point, Francis Bacon, who wrote very extensively on this question of method, scientific method. And it is, by the way, a kind of unfairness to Bacon to think that he put forward a rather crude version of the inductive method. People think he said, you know, you gather data and then you superinduce theory on the data to explain it. Now, if that were right, of course, what you would do is you would take a stool, a notebook, and a biro, and you go and sit in the field and wait for data. And then after a bit, when you've got some, you make up a theory to explain it. But obviously, that's not how it works. Obviously, you have an hypothesis. You think, maybe things work this way. And then you say, well, what would test that hypothesis? What would really make you sure that you're on the right track, or what would show you that you're on the wrong track? And that identifies for you what's relevant in the way of evidence, either to confirm or to infer the hypothesis. So you conduct an experiment. You experiment, and the experiment tests. Or, remember that the word test has a synonym in the empirical case, and the synonym is prove. To prove something is to test it. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. The exception that proves or tests the rule. The way that you prove steel in a steel foundry by loading it to see how much stress it will take before it fractures. So these are the concepts of proof in the empirical case. And what proves or tests the hypothesis is the experiment you conduct and the expected outcomes. And if you get those expected outcomes, that just tells you you're perhaps on the right track, but it doesn't establish the truth. Because if the other thing you were reading in the Bible last night was Karl Popper, then you know that the only conclusive thing you can get is a refutation of the hypothesis. And Bacon was very conscious of this. He was very conscious of the way that iterated experiment, was necessary to evaluate ideas that we have about the world, and very conscious indeed that the only authority over our speculations about how the world works and how nature is empirical evidence, is going and looking and seeing, using our five senses and the extension of our senses by means of telescopes and microscopes and oscilloscopes and any other kind of scope, including, of course, mathematics, which is one of the most powerful of lenses that we have to make sense of the physical world around us. So it is a matter of very, very great interest indeed that there should have been this focus, this energetic effort to make sense of best method, of how we really should inquire, so we should get to the truth of things, or as close to them as we possibly can, to fight our way out of the tangles of Hermeticism and Kabbalah and the rest. And those things, Hermeticism and Kabbalah, were incredibly seductive. The Kabbalah, as you know, is a very elaborate tradition of thought that comes out of the Jewish mystical tradition, and it had been elaborated into a very extraordinary system of numerological prophecy and the rest by the Sephardic Jewish community of Spain in the medieval period. Hermeticism was alleged to be even older, although it was proved by Isaac Casaubon in the early 17th century to be no older than about the first or second century AD. But Hermeticism was alleged to have been to be the doctrines handed down by a mythical figure, or perhaps a deity, called Hermes Trismegistus, who was said to have lived as long ago as Moses, or perhaps even earlier than Moses. And there were said to be many writings by Hermes Trismegistus that have been handed down all through antiquity, and they contain the secret knowledge, the ultimate code of how things are in the universe. There are still some Hermeticists now who believe that the 42 key texts of Hermeticism are hidden somewhere in Egypt. So it's Egypt, isn't it? These mystical things are hidden. And the number 42 is resonant with me, because isn't that the number that Deep Thought came up with in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? I've often wondered whether there was a connection there. It just seems like a silly number, doesn't it? But anyway, 42 are very important texts. But scholarship on the tradition of Hermeticism has suggested that actually the tradition first began, very probably in Egypt indeed, when the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, and they're fumbling the argue with the Thoth. They were both, by the way, the gods of writing, and they were both psychopomps. A psychopomp is a minor deity who leads your soul to the underworld after death. And it's a tremendous name. My students love that word. Psychopomp. They all write it down. It sort of sounds like the kind of thing you might want to be at a party later. And so after the Alexandrian conquest of Egypt, perhaps the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth, since they have the same functions, were amalgamated into Hermes Trismegistus. Now he was called Trismegistus because Thoth is always described as the great, the great, the great in every inscription in Egypt. Thoth the great, the great, the great. So thrice great. Trismegistus. So hence Hermes Trismegistus. And here are these documents, and they were allegedly in a sort of coded description of the ultimate nature of reality. And I have to tell you, it's a slightly sad reflection that Isaac Newton spent far more time trying to crack the numerological code of the Bible, and especially the Revelations, and working out when the end of the world was going to be, and trying to make sense of Kabbalistic and Hermetic notions, than he ever spent on physics. Human nature is an ally. So that's the case with Isaac Newton. But it was the first moment in the early part of this great century of genius, the 17th century, that people should think about method. Because we see this movement of thought, we see the first little cracks appear, we see Luther demanding liberty of conscience, then liberty of thought and inquiry. So people are exercising their liberty, dangerously to begin with, because it immediately abraded some of the cheapest doctrines of religious orthodoxy. But by the 17th century's midpoint, by the end of the 30 Years' War, which, as you know, had as its main motivation the attempt by Catholic Habsburg Europe to regain those lands in northern Germany and Scandinavia which had been lost to Catholicism, to become Protestants. And that was not the only reason why the war occurred, but one of the major reasons, because of course the Emperor Ferdinand II had been persuaded by his Jesuit confessor, Lamont Manin, that this was a holy cause to recover all of Europe to the true faith. But by the middle of the 17th century, the failure of that endeavour, what had failed along with it was the power of the Church to control thinking. In the first half of the 17th century, scientists wrote to one another. There was, by the way, a most magnificent postal service, and in these unsettled and uncertain times during the frightful wars of the 17th century, border controls and censorship broke down. So it was actually easier to send letters to people across Europe than it had been when the controls were in place. And there were a number of people. Marin Mersenne, the minimum monk, who was corresponding with Jane Carpenter, hundreds of other people around Europe, Hartlip and Oldenburg here in England, Persake in France. These were people to whom others wrote, and they would copy their letters and send them out again. They were like internet servers. They were sending on messages from scientists and philosophers and savants and distributing these ideas, new theories, new hypotheses, the results of experiments. And so there was this explosion of communication in the early 17th century among informal networks of scientists and thinkers. By the second half of the 17th century, those networks have become formalized. They've become the Royal Society of London and the Royal Society of France. They've become institutions backed by and given some funding by the state for the communal endeavour of scientific research. And that was the key thing that Francis Bacon had urged in all his writing, that there should be a community of scientists, that they should work together, they should share their ideas, they should check one another's researches and inquiries. Those hermeticists and magicians of the 16th century were jealous of what they thought they had discovered. They didn't want anybody else to know how to change lead into gold or live forever. So they wanted to hold on to that. So there was something diametrically contrary in their way of thinking about inquiry. And Bacon had argued repeatedly, again and again, in any number of his writings, right from the 1590s, right up to his death in the 1620s, that science is a communal endeavour, and there should be publicly funded institutions to support scientific work. And then the Royal Society was finally instituted in 1662 with the Royal Charter, and given some money. This victory had been achieved, the victory of science as a respectable, important, productive, forward-looking enterprise. And that, therefore, set the scene for what happened next. It's a bit like what Katie did next. But what happened next was, in the 18th century, the 18th century Enlightenment was predicated on the idea of exporting to all our thinking about society, politics, and human nature, and human endeavour, and to the institutions of society, the ways of thinking which had proved themselves in the natural sciences in the 17th century. That is, to use the same sorts of methods, the same testing of hypotheses, the same frank exposure to fact, the same desire to be guided by the facts and not to have your conclusions in advance and to look for evidence to support them, which had been the old way of doing things. So the philosophers of the Enlightenment, the editors of the great French encyclopedia, were trying to diffuse the scientific approach to all matters, sociologically, psychologically, into the study of history. And of course, that meant that the guiding principle in all those things was reason. But what we're not going to do is take any kind of authority or tradition, but we're going to just apply reason to them. And the great theme of the Enlightenment was the government of reason, the authority of reason over our inquiries. But the one stumbling block was that there was just no resource, no way of understanding how it could possibly have happened that the universe might have originated, it might have been its own cause, rather than caused by some other agency. And of course, if you say if you're puzzled by how there could be a universe at all, and so you say, oh well, then perhaps the best thing to do is to say that it's created by God. All you've done, of course, is to push the problem back one step further from a mystery about how the universe comes to exist into an even greater mystery, which is how could there be a God who created, and how, etc., etc. I often say to people, this way of thinking is much illuminated by using the name Fred instead of the word God. You say, how did the universe come into being? They say, Fred made it. Well, you see the utter vacuity of that remark. I mean, it doesn't explain anything at all. Do the next thing to say, well, who the heck is Fred? And how did he manage that? And that, of course, is exactly the question that you want to ask. And we now know, anyway, that of course the universe had a cause itself. It's its own cause. And there's no great problem now in making sense of that. My friend and colleague Lawrence Krauss has just written very eloquently about how you can get a whole universe from nothing. That's the title of his book, The Universe from Nothing. But life, how does life begin? And what about this rooted belief that humanity has, that we are special? We're special because we're intelligent, we have language, we build societies, we are conscious of moral demands on us. Apparently unlike any other creature on the planet. Aren't we different? Well, right back in the most ancient of times, long before even Socrates, in the work of Anaximander, in the work of Democritus, in the work of Xenophanes, in Aristotle himself, we see a belief in evolution, that life arose from the seas, came out of the mud. We see in Erasmus Darwin, in the writings of Charles Darwin's own grandfather, his wonderful poem, full consciousness of the fact that if you look at the evidence, if you look at fossils, if you look at bones, we compare a man, I would say a woman, and a chimpanzee, you will see that there is a great similarity there. And surely this means that life has evolved, that we're all part of something which got it all going and breathed life into the first lump of clay, and then probably went away or doesn't get any more interest any longer. But there was a very prevalent attitude among educated people in the 18th century, mainly for this one reason, that the origin, if not of the universe itself, then of life in the universe, seemed such an uncrackable puzzle. And when people reflected on it a little bit, of course they came up very easily, naturally, with the kind of view that Paley put forward, the famous argument from design. You look at us, you look at the eye, you look at the complexity of any living thing. It really looks designed. Look at creatures which mimic leaves, or butterflies that look like birds when they open their wings and so on. And it all does seem to have a purpose. It seems as if an artificer has been at work. And of course everything is designed, but it's designed by natural pressures. It's designed by the selective pressures of the environment and creatures as over very, 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 very long periods of time. And this was the other great point. There was no conception of just how antique the world is. I mean, tradition had said a matter of thousands of years only. But to think in terms of hundreds of millions of years, or even 4.5 billion years, which is how old the planet is, seemed unimaginable. And nothing in the way of observation even began to support these sorts of hypotheses until the work in geology by Lyell and others really did expand time to the point where suddenly it became imaginable that the same principle that would give you a Shakespeare play, if you had enough monkeys and typewriters, would give you the human eye and brain. And this is the thing that Darwin saw. He saw it early and he kept his mouth shut. He saw it while he was looking at fossils as he travelled, while he looked at different zoological species on the great Beagle voyage. And when he meditated on these things when he came back to England. And for a very, very long time, he made him ill. He was ill most of his life, I think, out of sheer anxiety, as if an idea was blocked in his alimentary canal and couldn't move it, and he suffered as a result. But the realization that these more than intuitions, which have existed in intelligent thought since before the time of Socrates, were actually literally true. So when he published The Origin of Species in 1859, it was, of course, it was impelled to do it because Wallace was just about to publish. Discussion of these things was in the air. There had already, in fact, been some publications asserting that evolution was correct, but without giving a mechanism, and what Darwin had was a mechanism. Incomplete, of course, because Mendel had yet to grow his peas, and the understanding of genetics was still required. That took another half century to be fully understood. But he had the mechanism. And the really revolutionary thing, therefore, was the publication of Origin of Species, because that put the capstone on this process which had begun with Copernicus. This was, now we were no longer at the centre of the universe, but we were also no longer at the pinnacle of biological creation. We were on a planet in a pretty ordinary solar system, in an outer arm of an ordinary galaxy among trillions of galaxies, and we were also just one kind of animal, and a pretty destructive one among other animals on that minor planet. Now some people have said, actually this has all the lineaments of a new myth, because it's taken us away from the centre of the universe in the theistic conception, and it has put us back at the centre of a quite different universe, the universe of thought, because we're all so smart. And of course, a little bit of reflection on that shows you that one thing that scientists know, and they know very, very little. What scientists do is they hypothesize and they test, but no self-respecting scientists say they know for certain anything whatever, because they are committed to the defeasibility of inquiry. The fact that we might have better evidence, more evidence, different evidence, that we might have to give up some of our most cherished theories, revise them, and develop them. And that is the exciting thing about science. You have to be open-minded and prepared for the wonders. My very good friend Jacinda Verdi is one of the senior physicists on the Large Hadron Collider experiments in CERN, on the CMS experiment, that's the compact muon solenoid experiment. And as you know, there were two quite different experiments, the ATLAS and the CMS, looking for the Higgs boson, looking for this particle at a certain set of energy levels, which could only be achieved by getting those protons to smash into one another at extremely high fractions of the speed of light. And he said, after the Higgs had been observed, and there was great excitement, and we were at some reception together, he said, you know, it would have been even more exciting if we hadn't found it. Because then that would have meant that we were quite wrong about the atom, and that would have been really exciting. And then we would have known that there was a great number of mystery that we wanted to solve. And that's wonderful. It's such a lovable attitude of mind. And that is the scientific attitude, made possible by this great change of vision. The change from thinking we are the centre of the story, and instead to thinking that knowledge and truth is the centre of the story. And where Charles Darwin sits, right up there on the very peak of Parnassus, with all those other great minds, those other great scientists, Newton and Boyle and Copernicus, and those who inquired like Descartes and Bacon have done, into this great question of how we go, how we try to find out. He sits up there as having put the last great piece of the puzzle in place, which tells us that for many, many centuries, if not indeed millennia before that, we've just been looking in the wrong direction. And so his achievement, and what we celebrate today, is the fact that he turned our heads to look in the right direction at something vastly more wonderful and vastly more promising than anything that had gone before. Thank you. For so long, I've left on little time for questions, and I'm on a fixed time train ticket. So if we talk fast, we can have a couple of questions.
We've literally only got 5 minutes, but any questions?
If in fact it seems the love of power is what drives the world to a downhill trend, what hope have you that we can change that? The love of power, not power, but the love of power.
Well, I'm an optimist. I don't see there's a heck of a lot of future in being anything else. I'm the Winston Churchill on that one. And so my optimistic view is that it's not everybody who wants power just for its own sake. There are certainly people like that, but then it's very probably the case that the desire for power, the lust for it, is in itself instrumental. Because what power gives you, of course, is access to things. So if you bring in more money or something like that, so it's really instrumental. But what most of us want, I think, is not so much power as some measure of organising control over at least some parts of our lives, so that we can feel that we're living in a way that is fruitful and productive for ourselves. I'm reasonably confident that the great majority of our fellow human beings are peaceful, constructive people who are generally very well disposed to other human beings, for the good reason that we are social animals, essentially social animals, needing our relationships with one another, respecting one another's needs and interests mainly. And the degree to which we are hungry for things, avaricious for things, lustful for things, tends to be, on the whole, moderate. Because if it weren't, of course, given the 7 billion of us on the planet, things might be a lot worse than they are.
One more, and then we need to let Anthony go. Yes, John.
Thinking, but what's next for human beings? What do you think of the view that's being put forward that we will merge with artificial intelligence to become even cleverer superhuman beings?
Yeah. This is almost inevitable, by the way. I mean, we are already genetically modifying ourselves like mad, because a lot of people who might have died young in past times now survive the illnesses that would have weeded them out, so to say, and go on and marry, reproduce themselves. And so we're very probably in the very early stages, I suppose, of a sort of genetic shift in that way, which will be expedited and potentiated by the great discoveries that we now have already made on manipulation of stem cells and the like. And unfortunately, we have a bad attitude in this respect, that when we can do things, we tend to go ahead and do them. We never ask ourselves the question, because we can do it, it doesn't follow that we should do it. And it's inevitable that wealthy people get access to these resources. They get to want their children to be tall and blue-eyed and blonde and tall and brown-eyed and dark-haired, perhaps we should say, and very intelligent, able to run fast and the like. And they'll go for it. If it's possible to do it, if you could in vitro modify human embryo so that it has these outcomes, it's inevitable that it will happen. And perhaps the most prescient picture of this is in Brave New World, in the Aldous Huxley novel, where there are two different kinds of human beings emerging more and more as these changes take hold.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Another big round of applause.